Okay, so let's talk about when we replace a regulator unloader valve, how to set it properly for the proper pressure, as well as making sure that it doesn't overload the system. Here we replaced a trap pressure unloader valve. It's all plumbed, it just needs to be set for pressure. And when we say we're going to set for pressure, then typically the way that a lot of folks do it is they put a gauge on the gun and they set it for whatever the machine is rated for. We'll always start off with a new nozzle on the tip of the gun. This one's rated for 800 psi. What's happened here is that the system was set for 800 psi, but the circuit breaker kept tripping. So what this technician did was went ahead and reinstalled the gauge and put a volt and amp meter on here, and we were checking amperage. We can get our amperage reading off of the nameplate of the motor. The nameplate of the motor will always say what the maximum amperage allowed is. In this case it's 18.2, right in that neighborhood. So we know we don't want to go over 18. This one was running at 16 amps, which is good. Obviously that's well within the range of the 18, and it was at 800 psi. But it keeps kicking the breaker. So as we continued to dig a little bit deeper, what we found was that the regulator had been turned down to a maximum of 800 psi, but it was cranked down too far after that, so that the actual bypassing pressure was much higher, and which caused an amperage spike of about 24, 25. It's pretty high. And so that was what was kicking the breaker. What we want to do is, if the unit's operating at 800 pounds, we want to run it in the bypass mode about 850, 900 pounds with the least amount of amperage spike. So the way that we set our regulators is, rather than set it based on PSI on a gauge, we set it based on the amperage. So what we're going to do is we're going to start this up, and I'm going to adjust the regulator, and as I adjust it, I'm going to be keeping an eye on my amperage. And as my amperage comes up to maximum amperage, in this case it's probably going to be somewhere around 16.5, then I'll go ahead and crank it until it stops, and then I'll back it off. I'll back the regulator off until it drops down to about 15.5, 16, and then I'll crank it back in, maybe a quarter turn, a half a turn. That way I know I'm right at my maximum, but I'm not exceeding the load on the motor. And then I'll cross-reference that with what my gauge is. I'm more concerned with what the amperage reading is. That's a good indication of the electrical load within the system, rather than what the actual gauge says. We could give them whatever we want in terms of the gauge, but it may not be reliable, and reliability is the absolute key. So let's go ahead and get started, and it's going to be a little noisy, so I'm just going to let the camera show exactly what I'm doing. Cranking up the pressure. You can see the amperage on the very top. It's going to start coming up as there's electrical load on the system. Now we're at 13.6, 13, 14.2, 15. Now we're at 16. Okay, now you can hear the ratchet still ratcheting, but nothing's happening on the amperage. So that tells me that we've reached maximum pressure. Now we're cranking it too far, so I'm going to back it off. Now I'm backing the adjustment screw on that regulator off, and I'm looking for that amperage to start dropping. Now we're at, okay, so we just got a little bit of movement there. Now we're at, okay, 15.2, so I'm going to change the position of my ratchet, start tightening that back up again. Okay, now we're at 16.3. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set it right at about 16 amps. 16.18, 16.19, right in that neighborhood. That's pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get the gun, and we're going to shut the gun off and see where the amperage spikes out at. Got 11.1 in the bypass mode. We're at 16.1. again discernible, the amperage increase now when you release the gun. It goes into bypass mode almost instantly. You're not hearing any spike. That's the way we want it right there. We're at 16 with the gun open. We're at 10.8 with the gun closed. Now we look at our gauge. And our gauge is reading about 700 pounds. So we lost about 100 pounds operating pressure. The user will never know it. And it looks like our trap pressure is right at 1,000. So that's pretty good. So that's going to solve this particular problem of the circuit breaker tripping just by making sure that that regulator is properly set. You have two settings on that. You have your operating pressure and then you have your bypass pressure. In this case, the operating pressure was correct. The bypass pressure was way too high, causing an amperage surge that kicked the breaker. If you have any questions, talk to your supervisor or contact us at www.aefresno.com.